Bueno, muchas gracias por venir. Es un placer ver la sala llena para escuchar aquí a Zadie Smith. Muchísimas gracias al festival por insistir. Muchísimas gracias a vosotros por venir. And thank you very much, Zadie Smith, for being here. And thank you, especially thanks to Carolina and Juan for having me to talk with her. So, here we are.
Yeah, that was crazy. I've never seen it. I've aged a lot. That's what I thought, looking at that. Yeah, what are you going to do? Yeah. Carry on.
When you do this film, what do you thought about yourself?
I don't know. It's like being present at your own funeral. It's a very strange experience, but yeah.
So we are here to talk about the fraud, la impostura en español, que acaba de salir. It's your historical novel, which you've been avoiding writing for years, and you wrote an article for The New Yorker called On Killing Charles Dickens. By the way, the person who made the illustration for your article is Javier Jaén.
Oh.
So it's a pretty coincidence. So why you didn't want it to write a historical novel?
I think a lot of my writing comes out of frustration, because most of the time I just sit in my house with my kids, and I'm not, I don't feel like I'm a part of the discourse. I just mind my own business. But as everyone knows as a citizen, as you mind your own business, listening to the way people think about things, you have your own feelings. It's like when you're shouting at the television, you must do that sometimes, or at the radio. And I think over the past, definitely, from about 2016 onwards, the way I would hear people talk about the past as this kind of generalized place, with not very many specifics, just this place where everything was terrible and everything's better now. And I just found myself more and more irritated at that portrait. And so I think that's often the impetus when I write. It's like some voice in me says, not that, but also usually not that.
Yeah.
A third thing. So the book comes out of a kind of third instinct, that the past is neither this place of terrible, unremitting oppression, and neither is it like a beautiful, nostalgic place where everybody was happier and purer and better than they are now. Neither of those things. So the book comes out of that kind of contrarian instinct, I guess.
Yeah. And in the book, there are like two stories, and I don't know if you want to summarize.
I don't want to summarize them.
No?
It was hard enough writing it without having to summarize it. But the thing about the two books, it's definitely two books in one book. I was aware of it as I was writing, and I could have stopped, and maybe I should have stopped. But my instinct was that you could write a book in much better taste about plantation slavery, for example, and you could write a book in much better taste about the hypocrisies and absurdities of what people call civilized life. And those would be two different books, and they would be much more appealing, I suppose. But as a principle, I feel the fact is that those two things happen simultaneously in life. That, for example, as we sit here doing a lovely literary festival, people are suffering and dying in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan. So to me, these are not separate issues. So I wanted to write a novel which I am perfectly aware is in bad taste. It's in bad taste to be laughing on one page and then suddenly in a plantation on the second page. But that's life.
Yeah. So if you don't want to summarize your book, os cuento un poco yo. Hay dos historias, una es el Tichborne Case, que es un juicio real que duró bastante tiempo, se prolongó mucho en el tiempo, tuvo como mucho interés en la gente, se seguía mucho en los periódicos, etcétera, etcétera, y ese sería como una de las historias, y la otra está centrada en la vida de un escritor, la vida cotidiana de un escritor, que es un escritor como en decadencia, que se llama Ainsworth, y estas dos historias se conectan por varios puntos. I said that there are two stories that are connected by many things, and one of the things is the women in Ainsworth house. Two women, the housekeeper, which is, I think, the main character, and my favorite is who is Eliza Touchet,
Yeah.
and the second wife of Ainsworth. So I would like you to ask about this, Eliza.
I mean, the weird thing about writing this book to me is that I spent 10 years reading about Andrew Bogle,
Yeah.
who is an enslaved man in Jamaica, a real person, and William Ainsworth, who was a novelist of the 19th century, very successful until he wasn't. And that, in my mind, was what the book was about, those two men. And then when I started to actually sit down and write the book, which is a long time after, a lot of reading and a lot of thinking, and I try and write quite subconsciously, so I don't plan novels. I just do all the reading, and then I think, well, I finished the reading, and now I'll just sit down and write. And I don't try to think about much. That's just the way I work. So I sat down to write, and as often happens in my novels, as sometimes PhD students point out to me, someone rings a door and a door opens. So it's quite often, it happens in White Teeth as well, it's quite often this moment of encounter. You open a door and there's somebody there. And then there's the question of whether you're going to be hospitable to that person or not. So the same thing happens here. The doorbell goes and the housekeeper opens the door, and there's a boy who's come to work on the house, to fix a hole in the ceiling. And I don't remember thinking anything apart from, well, let the housekeeper open the door and she'll take him up to look at the hole. And that was the end of the first chapter, and then I started the second chapter, and she was still talking, and I was like, oh, well, that's strange. And then the third chapter, and there she still was, and I thought, when are we going to get to William, who I've spent 10 years reading about? And the answer was, we were never really going to get to William, because it turned out I like him a lot, but I wasn't that interested in him. And I think the problem is, I can't remember who said this, something that goodness writes white, meaning goodness is hard to write, because it's not that interesting.
Yeah.
And William is he's a good man, he's a kind man, he's a generous man. Eliza, I would not say, is a particularly good person. She's very smart, she's very funny, but she's not kind. She has a lot of opinions, and she was just much more interesting to write about.
Yeah.
So she took over the novel, and then that was that.
And there is also a play in the novel, because we could say that the fraud is also the novel in Eliza Touchet become a novelist.
Yeah, which was another thing I didn't plan, but I did notice in the reading I did, because one of the kind of central parts of the novels are these dinner parties. So London literary life, as it is today, it's always been the same, is a lot about dinner, people having endless fucking dinners. And these days with ottolenghi on the table, but in those days a lot of pheasants and ducks and a lot of port. Porto, it's your drink, but we like to drink it. And the other thing which is funny about 19th century London is that the post, there were 15, I think, posts per day. So you could send a letter at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m., all the way through the day, and it would get there that day. I mean, it's extraordinary to think about. So it's like email.
Yeah.
So you could organize dinners very quickly, or like texting, because you could send messages to lots of people the day before and organize a dinner almost immediately. So in those letters, of which there are, as you can imagine, hundreds of thousands of these letters saying, will you come to dinner? Yes, I'll come to dinner. What time? Back and forth. Quite often they mention Eliza. And I'm talking about people like William Thackeray, Wilkie Collins, who's not in the book but was at dinner a lot of the time, Charles Dickens. Quite often they will say, make jokes like, well, who's going to sit next to Mrs. Touché? I don't want to sit next to Mrs. Touché, and all this kind of thing. So I was interested in why they feared her, because they mentioned her tongue being very sharp, and it just interested me. I thought, well, here's a woman who was obviously smart and funny enough to interest all these very famous, really, British writers. I wonder what she was like. And she seemed to me like someone who might have written a novel given the opportunity. Of course, there must have been so many women in England who would have written a novel given the opportunity. I mean, one of the interesting facts about English literature is that, with the exception of the lesbians and the unmarried and unwed, you cannot find a woman writing a novel in England till the 70s. And that's because you can't write when you have a load of children. You just can't do it. It's impossible. Without help, without childcare. So I just imagine Mrs. Touché is just another one of those women who might have written if she'd had the chance.
And with Andrew Bogle, because it's funny that in the Ainsworth story, you choose Eliza Touché, and in the Tichborne case, you choose Andrew Bogle, not the main, the expected main characters of their story. And
I think I'm allergic to what young people call main character energy. I don't like main characters, and it's always like that in my fiction. I'm just not interested in heroes and the kind of attractive characters that you want to be or emulate. Or I don't sympathize with those people.
Why did you find difference between writing a historical novel and your other novels?
I don't know if it was because it was a historical novel. It might also be about being in my late 40s, and I think one of the great things about novel writing is that you can get better at it. You get, at least at the technical side of it, and I think there's a sweet spot in your 40s where you both know what you want to write about and you can write about it. And I think that sweet spot is very short, because very soon you can still write, but you have nothing to say. So it's a tiny window that will soon be over. But for that reason, it was just very fluid. I didn't have the kind of technical issues I might have had when I was 24 or 32, or I didn't have those problems anymore. So it was more like it just went so quickly. Sometimes you wanted to slow it down because it was such a pleasure, but also because the story was true. It's not about the story being in the past. The facts are the facts. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have to invent a plot. I didn't have to imagine a story. I just had to embroider around the truth, yeah.
And in terms of working in archives and all of that?
I mean, all of that has been made. Like when I wrote White Teeth, my memory is I was going to the Imperial War Museum, or I was, in archives in Cambridge looking for stuff about the Indian Mutiny of 1857. I mean, those days are over. Like in the case of writing about the Hope Plantation, which is a plantation that was in St. Andrew's Parish in Jamaica, every single person on that plantation, there's a record of their name, their age, who they gave birth to, when they died, all digitized by UCL in London, University College London. And they have digitized copies of everything from every plantation in Jamaica. So it's just a different thing. And for that reason, because information is so easy to get now, to me it's completely devalued. Like, I'm not interested in novels filled with endless facts, because facts are worthless. You can get them anywhere. They're too easy to get almost. So I was very grateful to know all the names of every human on that plantation. That was a beautiful thing. And I used the names, and the ages, and I knew when they died and what part of the plantation they worked in. And so that was lovely to know. But the rest of it had to be, no piece of paper will tell you how people felt or how they suffered exactly, or their joys or their sadnesses. So that part is always still your job.
And I don't know if you had produced to the genre, to the historical novel itself, and how did you manage it?
Sorry, ask me again. I was lost a little bit. Sorry, say again.
If you had produced against the historical novel, and after writing a historical novel...
I mean, I always thought it was impossible to write a historical novel because I thought it looked too difficult. And I had an example with Hilary Mantel, who I knew, and I can remember having lunch with her and her describing these books she was going to write in great detail and great length, and describing all the research she was doing. And I listened to all of that and thought, Jesus, that sounds like hard work. And I didn't think about it ever. It just seemed like to be in a different realm. But I think in Hilary's case, she's talking about the 1600s. This is a different world. And 1837 is not a different world. It's really yesterday. This is the world of our great-grandparents. It's extremely close. Everything is very similar, in fact. We're talking about the same restaurants, the same buildings. My house is 1899. It's not distant, really, in London. So it didn't take the kind of imaginative leap that Hilary had to make, which is really quite significant.
And what did you see in the Victorian era that you wanted to tell?
The analogy originally in my mind was just this persistent sense I had in the late 2018, 19, 2020 period that everybody seemed to be lying all the time to themselves, to other people, that there was this extraordinary gap for a lot of, obviously in the life of, celebrities or whatever, you expect a gap between presentation and real life. But what was weird to me is that everybody had become like that. Like everybody is using these mediating platforms to present themselves in various ways. So I just thought how existentially exhausting that is. And in the Victorian period, something similar is going on for a different reason, to do with propriety. But the secret life is, the land of the secret life is very large in the Victorian period. So people are having their sex lives are secret, their family lives are secret, they're often bigamous, multiply married, so much is being hidden. And I thought I couldn't think of a time where as much was being hidden as right now.
And do you open our eyes to many things, including sexual lives of Victorian people? Like they had complicated relationships that they are a little unexpected.
I know, but why are they unexpected? That was really struck me, talking particularly to younger people, my students in particular. They had that idea that, like Philip Larkin, that sex had been invented in 1963. But in their case, they believed it had been invented in, 1997. And it's so strange to me, that idea that you have invented some new sexual habit or idea. It's impossible.
Yeah.
We've been around for hundreds of thousands of years. People have had sex in every possible combination, and there's nothing new under the sun in that area. And I guess the vanity of young people sometimes, that they think they've created some new sexual revolution. But the revolution is only in language. It's not in physical reality. Bodies can only do so many things. And there's nothing new there. So my assumption is always that people have been having all kinds of sex since the beginning of time. The difference is speaking about it. So I wanted to depict people who were doing the things that humans do, but may not have a language for it, and certainly not do not form their identities around it, and have no political language for it either.
And there is some fascinating in the Tichborne case, because it's obviously a false claimant, but the popular movement to support him is really...
Yeah, it was huge. And I think I didn't even convey in the novel, because I had other things I wanted to do, how big it was, because it was it obsessed the entire country, and it spawned mini political movements within it. So around Tichborne case, there were journals that were started, there were 5 newspapers, there were movements around anti-vaccination, around working men's rights. It became a symbol of many other things, a lot like the MAGA movement actually in America, in that the MAGA movement is not one movement. It involves a lot of different conspiracy theories, emphasis, some about labor, some about gender, some about money. It's a very wide thing all around one man. And this was something similar, though it had a kind of leftist slant. But this one man inspired a lot of populist movements, and some of them are really familiar. Like there was this obsession with anti-vaccination. There was a belief amongst lots of working people in England that vaccination was a conspiracy against them, that they were being sterilized, that it was an aristocratic thing to eliminate the poor. A lot of the same things you hear today. So that echo was interesting too.
And I heard you talk, compare this case with O.J. Simpson case.
Yeah, I mean, that was an analogy which struck me, that it's another example of a case which on its surface seems absurd, and particularly if you have a kind of rationalist idea of things, you will find that case impossible to comprehend. Why were so many African Americans in support of this man who was obviously a murderer? And I was an older teenager when that was going on, and I remember very clearly this famous split screen on CNN, which was when the verdict was released. On one half of the screen were the white people in the supermarket with their heads in their hands, like shocked, and then the other side was people, black people in the streets cheering. And it was a complete, a very perplexing thing for a girl in England to see. I couldn't understand, why are they cheering for a man who murdered a woman, you know, for a domestic abuser and a psychopath. He is a psychopath. But I guess when I moved to America and understood what this court system had been, you know, for the past 100 years, it made more sense. The court system itself is corrupt, was corrupt, and was unjust. And that case revolved around, if you remember, a policeman who had, in fact, left objects of evidence, planted evidence. God knows why, because, of course, O.J. was guilty. There was no need to plant evidence. But he was part of a system in which that kind of thing went on a lot, and in which all white juries were continually convicting young black men. So all of that history had come into that courtroom. So that interested me, the idea that an obvious lie can pass through an obviously corrupt court to reveal its corruption. And something like that happened in the Tichborne case. This is a court system in England which, from the 1600s, had been punishing specifically the poor. So England was a place with debtors' prisons. All the way into the late 19th century, if you were broke, you could be imprisoned for being broke. You could be hung for stealing food. You could be sent to Australia for very minor infractions. And these things were not happening to middle-class people. They were happening to the poor. So I think when this enormous, obviously mendacious butcher from the working classes said, "I'm a lord, give me my money," this was resonant for working class people. They were like, yeah, get your money, and get your money out of this court. So it makes sense. And of course, with the added addition of Andrew Bogle, who would have also taken some of this money, presumably, if they had won, you could see a great mass of working people who empathized with Andrew Bogle. It was like, yes, you've been enslaved, and we're working in these terrible factories. You get your money too. So it was a kind of mass movement of reparations by any means necessary.
Yeah, and one of the topics in the novel is obviously slavery and the relationship with the colonies. What was your approach?
Well, you know, I was scared coming up to that part of the book because I did all the reading and I thought it's interesting the reading I've done because I am aware that people read a lot about American slavery and American cotton plantations particularly. And I'm talking about a completely different kind of business, sugar, and a completely different kind of land in what is essentially a penal colony in Jamaica. And I think for me, the key came, I read an essay by Primo Levi called The Grey Zone. Have you read that? It's a really great essay in which he describes his experience in the camps, but the essay is a particular argument because at that moment when he wrote it, I think it's the late 50s, all of this stuff was coming out in the papers about this man called the King of the Jews of Lot's Ghetto, and it was his job, he was Jewish himself, to make the list, give the list to the Nazis and then send the people to Auschwitz. So this became a kind of, it's like semi-scandal in the papers, like people wanted to find this man, people were furious with this man who basically emptied the ghettos. And Levi wrote an essay, it's not in defense of him exactly, but it was a very angry essay in the way that Primo Levi writes, which is with great control. And his argument was, you know, I was in these camps, and this King of the Lot's Ghetto was in these camps, and you were not. You who have picked up this newspaper. And you have no idea what people will do when they're in hell. And we were all in hell. And it really is not your business to judge what we did in that circumstance. So that was the first part of his argument. And then there's a second really interesting part, which is, even though that is the case, if you ask me, I make an ethical distinction between what various people did in those situations. And I keep that in my soul and I know it. But it's still none of your business. And no one who didn't live through what I lived through has a right to make these judgments. So that's what I took when I wrote about the plantations. I thought, this is a similar scenario. It's hell, basically, in which all the normal rules of human life have been suspended. And people are in the role of absolute subjects. So the thing which the camps and the plantations have in common is that you can do anything to a person in this scenario. No law covers them. There are no protections. You can do anything to them. And so that's hell. That's the place everybody fears to be. And Andrew Bogle was one of many, many men who was an overseer in these plantations, partly because when they sent Scottish people and British people to run these plantations, they often died very, very quickly of disease, of the heat, of just an unexpected environment. So there were not enough British people to run Jamaican plantations. So many of the people in positions of power were black. And so I was trying to write about these plantations to tell the truth, but also aware that there's some kind of idiotic reader who is sitting there thinking that Andrew Bogle is a bad guy because he ran this corner of the plantation. So I had to kind of write knowing that there are people who sit in their armchairs and judge the behavior of people in extremity. But I just had to ignore them. I wasn't going to write for them or around them, or I was just going to tell the truth. And the truth is that, I mean, one of the things that being in that position of power allowed is that you could put your children into bits of the plantation which were less dangerous. You know, you could have them making barrels for rum, or you could have them in the nurse's tent, or you could have them in the house. So also it's pragmatic a lot of the time. But that was the challenge, writing about plantations as they actually were, not as you may have seen them in American movies, but as these very complicated factories in which murder is happening all the time, and torture, and also business, you know, people working.
Yeah, in the novel is very interesting how you show the complexity and ambiguity in avoiding a monolithic view of things, because with the past there is a temptation to adopt a simplistic approach, and you gracefully avoid it. So I heard you in interviews talking about the way you wrote this novel, sending chapters to friends like they did in the Victorian era.
Yeah. I like to, I mean, that's the bit about me which is, I don't know if you call it, I don't want to call it traditionalist. I don't think I'm a traditionalist, but I've always liked the idea of being connected with people over great spaces of history. I like the idea that I am doing what people have done for a very long time, whatever it might be. And so I'm a writer, and so for most of human history, and most of publishing history, modern publishing history, people wrote like, they wrote with speed, you know.
Yeah.
The way we write now of, you know, I'm going to take a MFA for 7 years and write a novel of 100 pages over 7 years is not, that's new, that's very new. Whereas people used to write at great speed because they had to, for money, from Dostoevsky to Dickens. It's a job, you know, and they're writing to get paid every 2 weeks. And some of the greatest novels we know have been written under that kind of pressure, from Turgenev to Tolstoy. I was just interested in, like, what happens when you put yourself under that pressure, which most writers have always known. So I just wanted to see if I could do it. A lot of, like even the Word program, which I've written in since 1997, I've never written by hand. And that always makes me sad. Like, I would like to be able to write like humans have written since they began writing. But that I can't do. So I would have tried, I like to try and write this book by hand, but I wrote 2 sentences. I was like, ugh, no. It's exhausting. I can't edit the way I want to. I couldn't do it. But I thought at least I could do that, do it with speed, do it in that subconscious way that I think Dickens did it a lot of the time, writing at speed and letting your subconscious organize the plot. And
did you enjoy making this portrait of Victorian literary world?
Yeah, it was fun. Like I mean, a lot of writers, I know there are writers who don't like writers, who don't want to spend any time with writers, and who live far away from any writers. But I have always lived with writers in cities, in circles of writers, whether it was in Italy or New York or London. I like them as a breed, and I like to spend time with them. And so those parts were enjoyable to write, because it's an affectionate portrait. I know writers can be ridiculous and self-serious and vain and ridiculously competitive, and that's all in the book. But I think they are also, great talkers. They're great to listen to.
Yeah, and the novel, even if there are a lot of tragedy and slavery and awful things, I think it's your funniest novel.
I mean, it made me laugh. Eliza is very funny to me, and the way she moves through the world, and
her sharp comments.
Yeah, she's her comments about everybody else are very funny, and her blind spots about herself are very funny. Like, there's a moment where, she's an abolitionist. She spent a lot of time listening to ex-slaves or people from Jamaica describing the horrors of slavery. But there's one moment where she finds herself at a concert of the Fisk Singers. The Fisk Singers were a black gospel group who went around Europe, huge stars in the 19th century, singing gospel music all over, and came to London and were massive hits. And she goes to see them sing, and then afterwards she finds herself in a group of 2 black people and herself talking, and she's so she feels so awkward suddenly. She doesn't really know what to do with herself, and she's so she feels kind of ridiculous and isolated. And I thought that was funny about her, that she has such high ideals, but when it comes to practical life, she's kind of a goof. She doesn't really know how to handle herself.
And the novel does not follow a chronological order. It moves forward and backward. And I think this reflects your approach to writing as well, because of the thing that you didn't organize your books. And I heard you talk about an emotional timeline.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, when I think about my own life, I don't think about it in a kind of straight line from childhood to now. I think people do think emotionally, and when they walk down the street, they can be suddenly struck by being 10 or remembering being 25. Like every autumn, for me, whenever it gets to September, I'm back in college. I think about, you feel it. It's time for college, it's time for lectures, it's that beautiful time of year. And then you realize, I'm 48, I'm not going to college, we're done with that. So I'm trying to express life as I see it. And I think the other thing about what people think of as linear realism or whatever, that's TV shows. It's not your life. It's what you've been told is your life. Mm-hmm. And you've got so used to watching your life in those formats that you started to believe that's your life. But I don't think that's the way people experience their life in half-an-hour comedies or 2.5-hour flashbacks of movies. I just don't believe it.
Since your first novel, people have tried to label you, but I feel that each of your books has been a step towards your freedom as a writer.
I think different writers feel differently. Like I heard Sally Rooney saying recently that she really has no desire or need to transform with each book. She has her project, it's one project, and that's what matters to her. And I think her project is beautiful, but mine is different. And I think partly it's a 90s thing. I think all the artists of my generation, whatever form they're in, film or books or music, one of the things we were trained on aesthetically was the idea that you appear in a new form each time, from Madonna to Prince to, that it was that era, that's what progress is in art, the transformation from album to album. So I think that's something I grew up with. I don't think it's necessarily true, but it's deep in my DNA, the idea that the same thing can't happen twice. Yeah.
And do you think that the public image of a writer has changed a lot since you...
that's another thing Sally said, wise girl that she is. It's just totally unnecessary, all of this stuff. But Sally's a good example. This book is the biggest book of the season, probably of the year, and she is not on book tour. You will not see her anywhere. She won't be coming to Spain or anywhere, because the book is enough. And ideally, I think most writers wish that the book was enough. But it has transformed. I remember talking to Martin Amis about this. He's a generation above me. And when the Rachel papers came out, the book launch was him and his dad and two friends in his living room having a glass of wine. There were no readings, there were no festivals, there was nothing. The book came out, end of story.
Yeah.
So that's changed, and I think for a lot of writers who are shy, who are introverted, which is most writers, it's difficult. It's difficult. You're asking a writer to be an actor or a performer, and that's not what a writer is. So I don't know. For me, I've always loved the idea of meeting readers. That is lovely, and talking to them face to face, and also, of course, the book industry needs these things now, because otherwise maybe books don't sell. But I'm sure that ideal. Sally has the luxury of doing it, of course, but it would be wonderful if we let writers do what they do, which is sit at home and write books.
You write essays for magazines too. It's like commissioned work.
Say again.
You write essays for magazines like the New Yorker.
Yes.
And
yeah.
How does this affect your work as a novelist? Because I don't know if you always choose the topics for the essays of...
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I worry about it. I didn't expect to write so many essays, and I've got another book of essays coming out in September, and I didn't mean to write that one either, so I don't know why I keep writing essays. But people, things interest me, yeah. And the thing is, I used to say it was because, somebody asked me, like, commissioned me, like, but it's not always true. Like, sometimes I go and see a play, or I go, and I start writing the essay. Nobody made me, so it's clearly something that I feel the need to do. But it comes out of that same frustration of like listening to people talk for a long time about something and feeling the need to give them another way of thinking about it. Like particularly thinking which is not, which to me lacks clarity or is driven by emotional desire or I sometimes feel like I just want to intervene and say, have you thought about it another way? That's basically the instinct of the essay, just maybe could you try and think about it this way? But in a gentle way. I'm not trying to say, agree with me. I don't need anyone to agree with me. I'm just saying, have you thought about expressing yourself in a less violent mode? Have you thought about trying this? That's usually what it is.
A good example of this commissioned work is your essay about Kafka, if you want to talk about.
Right. I mean, that was a long time ago, and actually, that came about because when I published White Teeth, I think I was 24, and the immediate consequence of writing that book, apart from, it was wonderful to have it published and all of that, but I got a lot of requests to, in England, to do other things. And at that point in my life, I was quite even more of a refusenik than I am now. And I just didn't want to do anything else apart from write novels. So the things which I was being asked to do, which seemed to me stupid and not to do with my work, like TV things and things I didn't want to do, there was a lot of that. And then the second thing which would happen is that people all the newspapers in England would just ask me to write continually about other novels about multicultural Britain, as if I had no other thought in my head apart from multicultural Britain. And so I left England and I got bored of it and I went to live in Italy. And then one day I was at a writer's retreat that's run by a friend of mine in Tuscany. And she was good friends with Robert Silvers, who ran the New York Review. And he would sometimes phone her up. Everybody involved in this story was about 90, both the Baronessa who I was staying with and Bob. And sometimes he would phone her up to see how she was or to hear what writers were there. And he phoned, and I picked up the phone instead because the Baronessa is old and was tired and didn't pick up the phone. And he was like, who's this? And I was like, well, I'm Zadie. I'm this young writer. I'm staying here. And he said, oh, yeah, you want to write an essay? I was like, I don't know. He said, what do you want to write an essay about? And I was reading Kafka, so I said, well, how about Kafka? And he said, fine. And that was the first time that any editor had asked me or accepted the idea that I might have other interests aside from, the interest in White Teeth. So that was really exciting to me, the idea that in America, there was a possibility of writing about different things. So I took it very seriously. And I was quite scared because it's such a different world then. You have to remember this is 25 years ago. And the idea of a black girl of 24 in a New York Review writing about Kafka was not a thing at all. So I was very anxious. And I knew, I'd never read the New York Review, it's embarrassing. I'd never read the New Yorker, I didn't, this was not a part of my life. I grew up in Willesden, but I knew it was serious and that it was an academic thing. So I wanted to do the best job I could. And so I just took it very seriously. And I wrote about Kafka as a man. Yeah, it was a particular book that had just been written about Kafka, and I wanted to write about him as a man because I was very aware of how heavy the myth was around him. And there's always a lot of myth around writers, but in Kafka, it was transcendental. It was like talking about a god or something. And Kafka is one of my gods, but I know he's a man. I know all people are people, and I just wanted to kind of bring him back down to be a writer amongst writers, because I think you do him a disservice if you think of him as an otherworldly person. So it was a great joy writing that piece and thinking about him as he is. And actually, quite recently, my friend Daniel Kilman wrote a brilliant TV show called Kafka. I don't know if it's shown in Spain yet, but it's on German Netflix and now English Netflix. And he does the same there. He makes Kafka a man of a particular moment. And it's a beautiful, I think it's a 6-part TV series. But for me, Kafka becomes more beautiful when you consider him as a real human with that extraordinary imaginative capacity. Yeah.
And have you different approach when you write short stories and when you write novels?
Short stories are, for me, even more freedom, just the opportunity to be a different kind of writer for 5 pages or 10 pages. Or the problem with a novel is you get locked in, you know? You start a novel very optimistically, thinking, oh, I'm going to be, it could be anything, but then within 20 pages it's whatever it's going to be, and then you just have to, you're stuck for another 300 pages. So for me, short stories are really freeing, and Grand Union particularly was really fun. Also maybe opportunity for a bit of showing off, you know, and looking at other people's writing and thinking, oh, I think I could do that. Or at least I could do that for 20 pages, and then doing it and feeling quite satisfied that you could do it as well. So different tones, you know, like, for me, just like autofiction, which for me is just a genre. I was just like, oh, I wonder if I could write in that genre, and I gave it a shot, and yeah, it was fine. So it's that kind of thing, like just trying things on to see what they do, what effect they have.
And you listen to music a lot. I believe you sing as well. And how do the other arts influence your writing, if they do?
Music is hard for me. I think there's something Foster Wallace said, which I think is true, about a lot of novelists having another thing that they were almost very good at. And that does seem to be quite common. A lot of the time it's sport. So for David, it was tennis. But there's a lot of novelists I know who are all very good at something else, but not quite good enough to do that thing. And so have, there's a lot of painters, musicians, philosophers, just slightly short of what you would need to do that, and they become novelists instead. So music, I love music, I love singers, but I no longer listen to it with the intensity I did when I was young, because I find it quite, I find music very overwhelming. Like, I would never listen to it while I'm writing, but my love is female singers, basically, divas, I suppose. And so when a new one happens, like at the moment, this girl, Chapel Rowan, this makes me very happy, you know. It's wonderful to see somebody come into their voice. And when the voice is that good, whoever it is, Mary J. Blige, or, you know, over the years, there's always a new singer. And I always, you know, I'm always obsessed for a while, but then also, you know, it's a little sad. You always think, oh, maybe if I tried harder. But I love to hear a new way of singing, yeah, and there's always a new way.
Yeah, but for example, in your novel, I was asking me, by reading it, did she read loudly?
Did I read?
Loudly, your own novel? Like.
Oh, aloud?
Aloud, yeah.
I think there are different types of novelists, but in my tradition, in the English tradition, people like me, Edward St. Aubyn is another example that I know for sure. It's not conscious, but when you're writing, other people can hear you in your household doing the voices. Dickens absolutely did the voices, and when he did those readings in America, that was part of the entertainment, that he would he'd do Christmas Carol, he'd do every voice. He was a complete ham and liked to act. Salman Rushdie's another one. I think it's a particular kind of writer. You can't imagine Don DeLillo doing the voices. It's not a thing he's going to do. So I think it's just part of a particular tradition. I know I do it because my husband tells me I do it, but I'm not conscious of doing it when I'm writing.
I heard you talk about the art of reading.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, to me, it is an art, and I was kind of shocked, actually, when this book came out. I'm not going to sound like I'm complaining, but I was amazed. It was just anthropologically interesting to see so many reviewers, particularly in England, saying how complicated it was. And I was so fascinated by it because I honestly think that if the same book was published 20 years ago, no professional reviewer would have found it complicated. Because all it really is a time thing. And when you think about the books that we were reading 20 years ago, from, I don't know, Gravity's Rainbow to even The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, these are quite complex narrative forms. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is the pressure of newspaper writing in general. No one has any time, no one's getting paid. So it's just annoying to be made to have to think about a page for more than 30 seconds. But also there is definitely something happening with our comprehension, because just so much of the time when we're on our phones, we're reading one person speaking in a linear fashion. So the multivalent form of literature where there's no particular single source of a voice is immediately, I have it myself, like it takes a minute, it's like confounding. You open a novel and you're like, what, who, what? And what you actually want is someone to say, hello, I am, and of course a lot of novels do that now. Yeah. It's like, hello, I am writing a novel, here I am, hello. So I'm not even actually making a value judgment, it's just I've noticed it, that the capacity to deal with the idea that narrative doesn't come from one source or one voice or layers of irony, even with the essays. In the past few years, I've noticed people like not being able to read, like various literary techniques like irony or understatement are not, they're not comprehending them. So I'll get an angry email about an essay and I'm like, but the essay it literally doesn't say that. So that's really fascinating, that people's ability to actually comprehend tone, or a lot of that is kind of degrading. So it's interesting. I don't know what's going to happen, but I feel like I'm writing novels for people who still remember what novels can do. So I'm just going to keep going on, but it's clearly possible that there'll be no one left to read them soon. Yeah.
And what about London?
Yeah.
You've come back and it's...
Yeah.
So I think it's almost, in all of your books, is London. Yeah,
that's another surprise. Like I wouldn't have... when I started out, I never imagined that would be the thing that would be consistent in the fiction. But that is exactly it. And even the book I'm writing now, it's the same. It's completely local. I mean, I don't know. One theory is, like, when I think of my brothers when they were younger, they were both rappers, and it's certainly the case that when people are poor, you see it in music, the thing they feel most close to are their streets. You know, you feel like you have ownership of your streets because you don't really have anything else. So maybe that's what's left over in me. You know, a lot of the kids I went to school with, well, none of us are kids anymore, obviously we're all middle-aged people, but have this extreme feeling about our neighborhood, which I think when you're rich you don't have, right? When you're rich, it doesn't really, you don't give a shit about your neighborhood. You could live anywhere, you go anywhere.
You can buy friends.
Yeah, you're not a local person, you don't need to be local. So I think it's just something that's left over from the way I grew up. But I'm very glad of it because it just happens that I'm so lucky that my neighborhood is like so crazy interesting. So I got lucky. Like if I was living in Chelsea, it would be a problem. But I'm living in Willesden, and even now, like I got an email from my kid's school today and proudly saying, you know, there are 170 languages spoken in the school. So it's still the case, you know. So I don't have to really go anywhere to see everybody because everybody lives in Willesden. So it's really, I can talk to a Sudanese guy tomorrow, I can meet a Pole, I can meet a Ukraine. I don't need to travel. So it's been really useful.
And how it was to come back to your city and to your same street, I think. Yeah,
it's the same street. I mean, it was melancholy because what has been done to my country over 14 years of Tory rule is truly horrifying and criminal. So that part is really sad, you know. Because I live in this community. My kids go to these schools. I go to these hospitals. So I see it. I see that my kids' school is falling apart, and that the teachers there's no money, and there's, you know, I see the degrading of these institutions because I have to live with it, and I have to watch my kids in substandard schools, and I have to never have an appointment at the doctor's, and so I live in it, and seeing it is extremely depressing because you don't ever want to imagine that things are worse than they were 30 years ago. I mean, the schools weren't that great 30 years ago, but they were better. So it's tough. It's tough to see, but I just feel like everyone in my neighborhood is committed to the idea that even if we have no money, even if the government is going to abandon the neighborhood, we can still make something of it. So, you know, people do a lot. They volunteer a lot. They raise money for the schools. Parents who are middle class, who are educated, go in and teach sometimes, or do guest lessons, or I do. We all do that kind of thing. So I think we're just determined not to abandon ship yet.
So I think we have to finish.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ha sido un placer. Simplemente os recuerdo que ahora Zadie Smith va a estar fuera firmando libros.
Yeah.
Y muchísimas gracias a todos. Muchas gracias a Marian por la traducción. Seguro que ha mejorado mis preguntas. Y, bueno, ha sido un placer total.
Thank you.